So 49 years before Marcus Mariota helped win the Rose Bowl, you were playing the Rose Bowl.
That's correct. That's correct. I was probably the first Samoan that played in the Rose Bowl. I'm not sure of that. When you're raised in Hawaii, I mean, ethnically, I am of Samoan mixed. Culturally, I am of Hawaiiana. When I'm raised with people here, they would have an influence on the way you look at things in life. And I knew that go up there, don't shame your surname, don't shame yourself, and don't shame the state that you're from. And that was the driving force for all of us who were up there.
Before Marcus Mariota, there was Bob Apisa, a Samoan recruited from Hawaii who also made history on the football field nearly half a century ago. Bob Apisa, next on Long Story Short.
Long Story Short with Leslie Wilcox is Hawaii's first weekly television program produced and broadcast in high definition.
Aloha mai kako, I'm Leslie Wilcox. Bob Apisa was the first All-American college football player of Samoan ancestry, whose achievements helped open the door for Polynesian players like Heisman Trophy winner Marcus Mariota. Apisa's athleticism made him a college football star and led him to a long career as a stuntman in Hollywood's film industry. However, Apisa's early years were a struggle. When he moved to Hawaii at the age of 7, he couldn't understand a word of English. Where were you born?
Let's see, I was born in Whangatongo, American Samoa. That's adjacent to Pago Pago, American Samoa. That's the capital of American Samoa.
But you didn't stay there, obviously.
Fortunately for me and my family, when there were 11 siblings, I had 10 siblings rather, I was the 11th. There were 8 boys, 3 girls. And my dad, who was in the military at the time, he knew that the only way to improve our lot in life was to bring us from Samoa to Hawaii so that we can get into or be ingrained with proper education. I remember 63 years ago when I left American Samoa in 1952. And I remember pulling out of that port, and we never seen electricity. I've never seen it. I lived in a house that was lit up by kerosene lanterns. And I never spoke English, could not understand a word of English. And as we left Samoa, 2.5 weeks later, we're pulling in at Honolulu Harbor. And the landscape of the land was just lit up. And I was on deck, and I told my brother, I asked my brother, George, his name was Siosi in Samoan, that's George. And I said, Siosi, makuako okele mo li kelisingi, meaning there must be hundreds of kerosene lanterns out there lighting this place up. And he looked at me, he said, Papu. Papu is Bob in Samoan. He said, Papu, elo mo li kelisingi o mo li wila, meaning those are not kerosene lanterns. That's electricity. I have never seen a switch. We never had an inside toilet. We had outhouses. So the confirmation of just bringing this whole new world was there. And the reaffirmation of that was the effort that we had to go out and strike it on our own. My mom and my father went up to as high as 8th grade in Samoa. They didn't have high schools. And that was one of the reasons why my dad brought us here.
What was the hardest thing for you? I can't imagine the culture, the language. What was the hardest thing?
The hardest thing was cognitive skills. Social etiquettes, things of that nature. I remember sitting in the classroom at Pearl Harbor Kai Elementary, and when the teacher would gather the kids around, and she would read us a book like "See Tom run, 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 run," sick, see Jane hop up, and everybody, and kids would laugh, and they would laugh, and that was my clue to laugh along with them, so I would feel like I'm one of them.
But you didn't know why?
But I didn't know why I was laughing. I did not know why I was laughing. So no special language lessons or tutoring, nothing like that? No, this was strictly through osmosis, or just by being around the vicinity of being around English-speaking military dependents, because I was brought up with military dependents at Pearl Harbor High Elementary. But I had teachers that helped me. I remember arriving in November and starting school late, because it started in September, and arriving, and then I had to reacclimate myself. Then I got hurt. We were playing Cowboys and Indians. I got shot in my left eye with a slingshot and bled for quite some time. So I missed more school. And as a result, I was set back a grade to repeat that same grade in order for me to get on. But I took that as an onus that I had some making up to do. But it was incumbent on me to make the move and make the motivation to move ahead. Where did your family live, and what was it like growing up with 10 siblings? It was a very disciplinarian upbringing. My mom and my dad were probably, I think in my lifetime, because he was a man of few words, but he would give you that look and you'll know exactly what he meant. He would probably, very soft-spoken. My mom was the general foreman. She ran the shop. She was very dedicated as a mother. She attended and made sure that we went to school. She took us there and picked us up. You know, she was all giving and all supportive. So at the time, what public school did you go to? I went to, I came out of Pearl Harbor High. I entered Aliamanu Intermediate when it first opened up. This, I think it was 1960, and I remember going to Aliamanu the very first day it opened up, and the Salt Lake City was just nothing but a salt lake and marshland. It really was a salt lake. There were no buildings, just that school there. And but from there, I had to go on to the 9th grade. They did not have a 9th grade. It was just up to 8th grade. And I had left the 8th grade, so I was going to the 9th grade. And what my brother Bill and I did, I mean, my Bill was the catalyst in bringing me to the old Interscholastic League of Honolulu. ILH. ILH, and that was the premier competition. And I think because he felt slighted, I didn't know any better, but he felt slighted that all the friends that we were playing around with when we were little kids all went to private schools. And he felt slighted. But the immigrants got left behind. But the immigrants were left behind. And so we concocted a story based on Bill's theory that if we had a district exception from someone that we can play at Farrington, because Farrington was in the ILH. So we asked my uncle, Reverend McMore, that's the Scotch part of my family, to use his residence address over at Republican Street in Kalihi. And he said, yeah, by all means. So that's how we ended up at Farrington. Bob Apisa says he didn't play organized football until he entered the 9th grade at Farrington High School. He was a natural at that and other sports as well. You did things like you were playing a doubleheader in baseball, and the coach ran you over to the Punahou relays, and you took 2 events there, and you came back and you played your second baseball game? Yes, that's very true. This is my senior year, and it was the spring of my senior year, and I had fiddled around with the track team so I can work out in my sprints and just starting off, because I knew I was a running back, I needed speed. But he needed a shot putter. And he knew that in my sophomore year, I tinkered around with shot putting, and it was only about, 2 feet or 3 feet and a lot of rolls after that, but I didn't know how to acquire the skill. So he came down, we were playing Roosevelt at Mo'ili Field, and he went up to my coach, Dick Kitamura, and he said, Dick, may I borrow Bob in between the games? He said, fine. I went up there. And are you still wearing your baseball shoes? And I was wearing my baseball gear. I took off my baseball top. I put on a FHS T-shirt or shirt, tank top, and I wore my baseball pants and my baseball leggings, and I bought a pair of tennis shoes, and this was packed. These were the best shot putters from all over the state, and they were all kind of, you know, laughing and giggling. And
how did that make you feel? Did that make you feel like...
I was laughing myself. But anyway, but they gave me, I said, well, you know, I want to do the best I can. My first throw, I said to myself, all I want to do is get some height on it. And I pumped it back and I let go, and all I heard was the crowd go, wow, because I had just broken the state record that was there for 8.5 years later. I mean, previous. And I'm walking around like I knew what I was doing, but I was looking for the first dog poop that I may have stood on before I came into the ring. But, you know, my second and third throws, I mean, boom, boom, little dribbles here and there. But the damage was done. I won the shot put. I set the state record for the shot put for 56 3 3/4, and I broke a gentleman's name. I think it was Souza, that was from Wailua in 1956. So I told the coach I got a second game, so put on my uniform and went back to play on the second game of the doubleheader.
How'd you do in the doubleheader?
I hit a home run.
It was a good night, a very good night. It was a good day. Bob Apisa's athletic achievements at Farrington caught the attention of dozens of college football recruiters. He chose Michigan State University, where he became part of a national championship team known for pioneering racial integration and for having 4 future Hall of Fame players, all African Americans. And he earned a spot in Rose Bowl lore. Were you one of the first guys from Hawaii to be in that Michigan State pipeline of athletes and college graduates?
I was. You know, when you're raised in Hawaii, I mean, ethnically, I am of Samoan mixed. Culturally, I am of Hawaiiana. When I'm raised with people here, they would have an influence on the way you look at things in life. And I knew that go up there, don't shame your surname, don't shame yourself, and don't shame the state that you're from. And that was the driving force for all of us who were up there. You know, Dick Kenny and Charlie Woodemeyer, when we were playing, we were ranked #1 in the country. We would go to Ann Arbor to play University of Michigan, or go down to Columbus and play Ohio State, or go down to South Bend to play Notre Dame, the top schools in the country. And we would look at each other. Just before we go out in the field, we look at each other, we do this. Meaning, in our own little, when we get together, it says, don't make, you know what? A of yourself, because that's how local boys related. Don't make A. So we look at each other and we just like, we knew, we were in tune.
And at the same time, Michigan State had an unusual makeup of its starters. I've read that there were 11 African-American starters, which was really unusual at the time, and you had far more players on the team. And then there was you, who became the first All-American a player of Samoan ancestry.
Yeah, yeah.
What a team.
Well, it was a great team. You know, at that time, in 1964, we had just legislated civil rights. In 1965, there was a Civil Rights Voting Act.
And that's when you were a sophomore?
When I was a sophomore. And I looked at Bubba Smith, and Bubba Smith would look at George Webster, and George Webster would look at Dick Kenny, and we would look at each other, people of color. Is it, you mean we could actually vote for the first time? And so there's a lot of history in that we had to encumber along the way. But the fact is, you look at things and you learn from those experiences. And having African Americans who were great athletes, being from the islands, again, you know, we had this mantra that you're there to represent your people. You go out there and kick okole.
So 49 years before Marcus Mariota helped win the Rose Bowl, you were playing the Rose Bowl.
That's correct. That's correct. I was probably the first Samoan that played in the Rose Bowl. I'm not sure of that. In 1966, and I was a sophomore, and we were ranked #1 in the country, undefeated, and we played UCLA, who we had beaten the first game of the year. We were behind by 14-12, and I had to go in. I had scored a touchdown, and Dick Kenny had. We went for a 2-point conversion instead of having Dick kick a field goal or a point after. So that made the difference. So when we scored the second touchdown, we had to make up 2 points, and I was given that opportunity, and it's been in lore, in the Rose Bowl lore, that throughout the years that I was stopped on the 1-yard line by Bob Stiles.
And Bob was, I think he was 175 pounds, you were 225, but he just threw himself at you,
Well,
right?
he was knocked out in the process. But the fact of the matter, he did the job, and that's the important thing. You know, you only had about 4 major bowls back in those days, and the Rose Bowl was the granddaddy of them all. That was the big one, and that's what I wanted to aspire to play in when I left Farrington, to go to a conference that would give me a shot at playing in the granddaddy of them all.
10 months after that close loss in the Rose Bowl on November 19, 1966, Bob Apisa played a part in history, taking the field in a matchup dubbed the Game of the Century. It was the first ever live TV sports broadcast in Hawaii.
I played in that game, and what happened was, prior to that game, throughout that week, people were just so jazzed up about the game of the century. We're both undefeated.
Okay, this was Michigan State and?
Notre Dame. And Notre Dame at that time had 1 minority on their team, just 1. They had maybe 27 in entire enrollment in South Bend. And that made them change and incorporate more people. But the fact that we were playing, I had a scroll of about 3,000 names sent to me from my high school, wishing us luck from Farrington. You know, those are cherished moments. And I remember knowing that when Dick Kenny and Charlie and I got together and said, you know, this is big time, guys. I mean, I'm a kid from Samoa, Halawa Housing, the Kalihi Valley, and we're playing big time. People are going to be seeing us live and direct for everything. And that game, I think it was Governor Burns at that time, I believe it was, that along with the legislature, and they petitioned the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, to see if they can see it live and direct. So they got permission from them, and on the morning of November 19th, 1966, there was a little satellite revolving around Sydney, Australia. The satellite was called Lonnie Bird. And they had that satellite beam a signal to Sydney, Australia, ricocheted that signal across to Honolulu. And for the first time, you know, 6 hours earlier, people from Hawaii turned on their TVs, whether it's an RCA, whether it's the Zenith or Motorola, one of those brands, with 2 rabbit ears. And with tinfoil at the end of it, and it was a small screen.
No cable television
No
back
cable
then.
TV, and they turned it on. They saw this splotchy white, you know, black and white figures, and they finally saw the game, the first live telecast in the history of Hawaii. That's one of the proudest moments of my life. I know I speak on behalf of my departed brothers, Dick Kenny and Charlie Whittemire. That made us so proud. If there's anything that we're proudest of, is that we helped facilitate this state into the 20th century.
After all the hype, the Game of the Century ended in a tie. Injuries sidelined Bob Apisa for much of his senior year at Michigan State. Still, he was chosen in the 9th round of the NFL draft by the late legendary coach Vince Lombardi, who was then general manager of the Green Bay Packers. That
was a great honor for me, Leslie, because when you're drafted by the world champions, they were just coming out of their second Super Bowl championship. And I was hoping to get onto an expansion team like the Miami Dolphins at that time, or Cincinnati Bengals. But lo and behold, I could hear vividly well Pete Rozelle, the commissioner, announcing my name over the PA, and I can hear them saying, you know, drafted in the 9th round from Michigan State, blah, 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 and I can hear this cheer, and my heart sank in a way because I wanted to go to a lesser, more developed team in developing. And here I am. I'm drafted by Green Bay, by Vince Lombardi. So, you know, people would see that trophy named after him on every Super Bowl. And 80% of the country probably don't know who this man is. I was honored to be drafted by him. I shook hands with him. I talked to him. I negotiated my contract with him. And that's quite an honor. The fact of the matter is, you know, to have that opportunity, to have that just the experience of someone who is so iconic in football folklore, and when I see that, and I'm tracing myself back to 1952 when that young man who stood in that boat who could not speak a word of English, and to where I am today, and those are some of the moments that I'm most proudest of.
You know, your career with the Green Bay Packers was fairly short because I think you had serious knee damage, didn't you?
Yes, I did. I signed a 2-year contract with them. I lasted a year. They paid my year off. And I knew I was, you know, damaged goods to pursue an NFL career. And because I paid that price during my collegiate career. But I since have had prostheses. I have 3 hip replacements, 2 on my right, 1 on my left, and a left knee replaced. So I walk with a shuffle and a distinct gait and a gimp and a limp.
And other than that, you feel good?
Other than that, everything else is working.
Right. Being a fullback, always working to move the ball forward, Bob Apisa didn't look back after the end of his football career. He went on to a 33-year career as a stuntman and sometime actor, following a chance encounter with a Hawaiʻi Five-0 casting director.
I sat there and there was this silver-haired guy with a beard, and he kept looking at me, and I'm saying, well, maybe I owe him money or something. So he finally came over, and he says, I'm Bob Bush. I'm the casting director for Hawaiʻi Five-0, the original Five-0. And he says, you're Bob Apisa? I said, yes. He says, have you ever done pictures before? And I says, the only pictures I've ever dealt with is Kodak cameras and stuff like that. But he says, no. So he said, I'm giving you a card. Why don't you give me a call tomorrow? And I had a few days before I went back to Flint. And so I called him on the lark, and he said, why don't you come in? I'd like to see you. So I went down to the studio over by Diamond Head.
Were you excited?
No, I wasn't excited. I just was, I didn't know why he wanted me to come in. Because I wasn't involved with filming. I did not know what filming was. Once again, this is a first timer. And as I'm walking in through the door, I noticed that there were about 3 big guys like me. And as I'm walking through the door, Jack Lord exits his office, and he's looking right at me. He says, well, you're the guy I'm looking for. I turn behind, I'm wondering if he's talking to the guy behind me, but there's nobody there. And then Bob Bush came out and made the introduction. And so Jack Lord said, can you come tomorrow and do a little scene with us? And I said, wow, geez, this thing is happening so quick. I mean, 24 hours later, I'm asked to come in another 24 hours later to do a jail scene with some people, some guys. And so I said, yeah, fine, you know, I didn't mind doing that for just to kill time and get a paid day's pay. And he said something, the dialogue between him and James MacArthur, Dano at that time. So Steve McGarrett was saying this to Dano, and it didn't make sense. So Jack looks at me and said, Bob, when I say this, just say, no, I didn't do it, or something to that effect. I don't quite remember. And so when he said this, then I said, no, I didn't do it. I was immediately Taft-Hartley'd into Screen Actors Guild. 48 hours later, no experience as an extra or anything. I went from point A to point Z.
Well, you were comfortable with yourself, right?
But I was comfortable with myself because I thought it was a new adventure, and I said, yeah, why not, And a week later, just before I left, or a couple days later before I left the following week, they asked me if I could take a Jeep and squib it and drive it. I said, hey, it's no big thing. And it had bullet holes. I mean, squibbed it and came right up to the camera. That was no big thing. And that's how my stunt career started. I've done train falls, I've done horse falls, I've done horse stampedes, I've motorcycled, car chases, falling off of fourth store buildings into water, and I had to, it's all timing. But if you're an athlete and you have the innate skills to adjust, to make your adjustment, before I go on a set and they ask me to do something, I'll turn them down too. So
this is 2015, and you are how old? 70?
I just turned the milestone of 70. And,
so it's a new stage of your life. What's it like? I mean, you're now officially retired.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's another kind of career, because you have to figure out how to spend your time, what relationships to keep, and which to invest time in, and where to go.
Well, a great relationship with AARP. But no, I'm just kidding you. I find time to do things. I can wake up and read the paper, and I go and work out, and come back and have lunch with friends, or the wife and I can just get up and go.
Bob Apisa lives in Southern California. At the time of our conversation in 2015, he was producing a project dear to his heart, a documentary about the Michigan Spartans' 2-year run as national champions and the team's groundbreaking impact on racial integration in college football. Thank you, Bob Apisa, for sharing your story with us. For PBS Hawaii and Long Story Short, I'm Leslie Wilcox. Ahui ho.
For audio and written transcripts of all episodes of Long Story Short with Leslie Wilcox, visit pbshawaii.org. To download free podcasts of Long Story Short with Leslie Wilcox, go to the Apple iTunes Store or visit pbshawaii.org.
People always point out that Bob Apisa came first. He was the first Samoan to really make a dent in the national scene. So you were the Marcus Mariota of your time. Marcus
Mariota is a gentleman that when I looked at that, the way he carries himself, I'm proud of him. He represents America. He represents the cross-section of all ethnicity. And he carries himself with humility, which is inbred from here.